Hi, this is the third video in this brief series on mood disorders. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the very, very broad reasons causes underlying depression. So remember that the DSM is descriptive only. It tells us what something looks like, how long it's been around, or it gives us severity, duration, and description of signs and symptoms. It's not interested in causes. And so here what we have is a list of a very broad way of thinking about what might be the causes of depression. So the first one that you see here is exogenous. Exogenous suggests external sources. So something happened in somebody's life, to cause them to be depressed. Typically that's something in the social sphere, right? In the sphere of when I say social, environmental sphere. Endogenous depression is depression with an internal source. And sometimes really all that means is we don't know what's causing it. It could be biological, psychological, spiritual, all of those, or something from the past, but for some reason it's happening and we can't see an external source. Interestingly, depression and its symptoms often cause external problems. So we get into this cycle of symptoms and problems caused by the symptoms. But when we talk about endogenous, we're talking about no clear reason for the depression that is external. So something internal. Now, we need to talk about grief. And we need to be able to distinguish grief from depression to some extent. They're not 100% distinguishable, are they? They overlap. Of course they overlap. That's humanity, that's life. When we lose somebody or something that is really important to us, we suffer, and we suffer in ways that look a lot like depression. I think what we want to make sure of is that we don't pathologize grief, that we allow grief to be, because there's some healing to the process in, I want to say, healthy grieving. So healthy grieving, typically when somebody loses a loved one, for example, is intense and painful and comes in strong waves at the beginning, and the person can feel like they're being knocked right off their feet. Slowly over time, the space between those great waves of pain grows. So the time in between the pain gets bigger. And slowly the person is able to be more distracted. So they might find some pleasure in, an evening with friends or something that they previously enjoyed. And it distracts them for a little while from their pain. It's very difficult to give a timeline to grief. I would not. Losses are different and responses are different. So imagine, for example, losing an 8-year-old child as opposed to losing an 80-year-old grandparent. Now, I'm not trying to be ageist. What I am saying is that there is a life cycle, and there are expected losses within the life cycle that are typically easier to live with than others. So our children shouldn't die before us, for example. And this is very generalized. I'm not saying that somebody wouldn't be shattered at the death of an 80-year-old grandparent, especially if they were very close. I hope you understand what I'm saying. A relationship that was very close is going to be different from a relationship that was not, obviously. There is also grief over losses that are not people, not necessarily relationships. I once had a client who talked about, he came in for depression and it wasn't clear what the cause was. It seemed to be endogenous. Interestingly, he had a broken leg, but that wasn't the reason. That was a skiing accident. It wasn't traumatic. He didn't seem to think that it had anything to do with his depression. After seeing him for a few sessions, it was a result of a dream. I don't want to get too much into detail here, but what came up for him, he was a middle-aged man. He was in his late 40s, early 50s. And when he was very young, he had wanted to be a dancer. But his father had kind of shamed him out of that. And he let that go, and he had, life. He had he was living a life that was successful, and he was happy with his life. Interestingly, what happened when he broke his leg was a realization about his own life and where he was in it. And somehow it brought up in him that he would never become a dancer. That, of course, it's not because he broke his leg at the age of 50, but it reminded him, it brought up all that old desire, and it poignantly pointed out where he was in his life and how he needed to maybe come to the last phase of grieving that loss of dancing. It was one last layer in that onion of loss. So, it's not simple. It's not always a person. And endogenous depression often has old external sources. So these, this is not simple. It's very interesting, and it can be very poignant and very powerful. Complicated grief, as opposed to what we might think of as more typical or healthier grief, puts a person at risk of having it develop into depression. So I described a little bit some of the typical phases of uncomplicated grief when losing a partner. The waves of grief, this time growing in between the waves of pain, creating memories, slowly being able to enjoy things. With complicated grief, the relief doesn't seem to come. The easing of the symptoms doesn't seem to occur. So after 6 months, the person is still experiencing those enormous waves of pain that can feel almost physical, and that are not abating. They're not getting better. The person's still not eating, still not sleeping, and really suffering. And what we find often with complicated grief is that there's guilt involved. The guilt could be survivor's guilt, and it could be guilt about the relationship. So Irvin Yalom, he passed away. He was a famous psychologist who also wrote, and he did some wonderful work. He worked with grief, and one of the things that he noticed early on was that people who lost a partner, who had a wonderful or a good, healthy, solid, long relationship, the kind of people who you thought would never survive this kind of loss. Let's say somebody who's been married for 50 years and had a good marriage, and now they lose their partner. You think, oh, they'll never survive that. Actually, those people tend to grieve hard and then move on, and actually often lead the rest of their lives healthily, with wellness, and often get into a new relationship. It's more difficult actually to grieve a bad relationship. So if the relationship was contentious, there was fighting, there was jealousy, there were problems, and then the person dies, often there's a lot of guilt involved and regret. And guilt and regret can lead to difficulty resolving grief. And when the grief doesn't resolve well, sometimes it can develop into depression, and we have to keep our eye out for that. It's not about length of time. Everybody takes their own time, and people grieve in different ways. But we want to make sure that somebody's grief isn't complicated and pushing them towards depression that could become chronic. Okay, that's going to be all for this video on exogenous and endogenous depression and some of the causes.